Alright, ignore my killer sunburn all over my face and my arms. Today we're taking a look at these two lenses from Tamron, the 24 and 20mm f2.8 prime lenses. So let's get into it. So I've been using these two lenses for a couple of months now. Again, thank you to Tamron Japan for loaning them to me. But we're just going to make a quick video to talk about them today. We're not going to go super crazy in detail to these lenses. They're a budget-friendly, compact, not super high-spec prime lenses. But Sony did announce, of course, a little while ago, they're very similar lenses, compact 2.8 prime lenses. So I was just curious to see how these Tamron lenses hold up or how they perform in general. I didn't compare them to the Sony lenses. I don't have them yet. But I just wanted to see how they do for a third or half the price of those Sony options. So as we jump into this, I will put up some of the more basic specs on screen, things that you can read online, things like their coatings and the number of aperture blades and all that stuff. You can read that stuff on their website, so I'll let you read it on screen right now as well. Again, we're going to talk about more of my experience using these lenses. We will take a look at image quality as well and talk a little bit about things like autofocus and whatnot, but for now let's just jump right in and start off with two of the things that stood out to me the most. Now, of course, even on paper, 20 and 24mm are not all that significantly different, but this 24mm lens actually feels a bit wider than you might expect if you are putting it side by side with some other 24mm lenses. And I'm actually recording on a 24mm right now, so I'll switch it out with this lens just to show you in this video. But because the 24mm is wider than you'd expect, the difference between these two lenses becomes even less. Now I'll throw up a couple of shots on screen right now just to show you the framing in some different locations of what the 20 and 24mm look like next to each other. But of course you can see a difference in there, but I wouldn't recommend you get both of these lenses. I've actually enjoyed using the 20mm a lot more. It just has that little bit more of a wide angle feel. It gives you a little bit more something special, while the 24mm for me just kind of fell flat as just a meh lens. Now, the other thing that did stand out to me almost immediately was the autofocus noise. And if you've watched any other videos on these lenses, they will all talk about it. These lenses are really noisy. And I think that on the one hand, they were less noisy than I expected them to be. But on the other hand, they were way noisier than other modern lenses that I've tried, specifically from Tamron. Most lenses that I've tried recently are pretty quiet and near silent, and I really kind of thought that we were a bit past that noisy autofocus time. For modern lenses that share a lot of the feel and the design of other modern Tamron lenses, I feel like I was a bit disappointed by the fact that these are not that quiet. But as I said, these do share a lot of design elements with other modern Tamron lenses. They are light and plastic, but they feel fine. They definitely don't feel that disappointing if you compare them even with more expensive Tamron lenses. These two in particular are nearly identical in size and weight, which does mean you do have to search around for the little markings on the lens if you take them out of your bag and you're trying to figure out which one you're grabbing. On the back of the lens, they do have this little rubber gasket. Of course, they have metal mounts, nothing disappointing there. On the front, they have these tiny little front elements, and they are both 67mm front filter thread sizes, which is a fairly common size for filters. They have these plastic petal-shaped lens hoods, which are decent in quality. They just snap on there nice and securely, but there's no lock button or anything on there. There's no buttons or switches at all on these lenses. They're completely dependent on being controlled from your camera. So if you want to switch from manual to autofocus, for example, it's in the camera. But as far as the physical design, that's pretty much all there is to it. Again, not super specced out or anything like that, but satisfactory for sure for the price. They feel very similar, again, to other, even more expensive recent Tamron lenses. So again, I've had these for a couple of months and I haven't used them a whole lot. I'm really not that much of a wide angle shooter, but I did take them out a number of different days in a number of different locations, and I just want to jump through some of those images and take a look at some different aspects of image quality. Now, we're just going to do it right in the computer, so I'm going to open up Capture One, and now also keep in mind that I've turned all the corrections off on these for chromatic aberration, distortion, things like that. I have done my standard import adjustments, but nothing that will affect image quality. And I used these with both the Sony a7C and the a7R IV. Alright, so this is one of the first days that I took these lenses out. I had the A7C, I had two bodies actually, and I had them both side by side to get as comparable shots as I could. So we had some strong light and some trees, so I wanted to use these shots to show you two things. The first, this is with the 20mm, is that as I go through these real quick, I'm not going to stop and wait for them to load even, but you can see there's no problems with flare popping up. If you look, even if I went slowly, you won't see any big orbs or ghosting or anything like that. I really didn't see any problems with flare in these situations. Another thing, of course, is that if you zoom in on these branches, really not any glaring issues with chromatic aberration here around these branches. Even off on this side, nothing major whatsoever. Again, this is at f2.8, of course, as you can see on the bottom of the screen here. Now, if we go through the same shots with the 24mm, again, I didn't really notice anything as I was going through these in terms of flare. If we go back here, let's take a look at these branches. Again, nothing major jumping out at me here. Again, this is on the A7C. As we move over here, move over to the corners, I really don't see much of an issue at all, if anything. I think this is a very good performance, and so far, optically speaking, these are very, very strong lenses. So these shots are just to show you some idea of the distortion on these lenses. You can see it's pretty much as you would expect. This is the 20mm. Of course, I had to move a little bit closer to get the framing more or less the same, but of course, both have distortion. They're wide-angle lenses for a couple $100. I think it's no surprise that they have some distortion. If you zoom in though, this is not closest focus, but these are both, again, very, very sharp lenses. You can see all the details in these paintbrush strokes here. Even as we move off to the edge of the frame here, lots of details in that paint, in that board. This is not the extreme corner, but very, very good performance. Another thing you can kind of start to see here is that the bokeh in the background is not that great. It is a little bit busy and distracting. I'm not sure you're really going to be focusing on that all that much in wide-angle lenses, but you can see here these branches in the background are not super buttery smooth. They are a little bit distracting, and we'll take a look at that again more in some other pictures as we go through. So now again, speaking of close focus, you can see here the shadow on the corner of these pictures because I had to get so incredibly close. These have, I believe it's a 1:2 reproduction ratio, which is near macro. Because these are wide angle lenses, you have to get really close to get that 1:2 magnification. But up at that close magnification, you can see that they both do pretty good. You can see the detail here, again in that paint. I think it's pretty impressive, and of course, you do get a lot of fall off when you're up this close. Again, looking at that close focus here, these both have about a 1:2 reproduction ratio. This is the 24mm on the left, the 20mm on the right. As you go in 100% on these, again, 61 megapixels if I can find where the focus was. It's really shallow depth of field at this point here, but I think it performs very well considering. Now when you get in this close, the background really just melts away, so I think that the bokeh here is just fine. It's dreamy and smooth and creamy enough. It's not distracting, but let's take a look in another picture at just a little bit more of a busy background with a less extreme example. So here you can see I've focused in on these buds or plants or whatever you want to call them here. Again, plenty sharp, lots of detail. This wasn't, I don't think, absolute minimum focus here, but I got pretty close. But you can see here the backgrounds do feel a bit more distracting. This just doesn't pop out from all that detail quite as much. And I think part of that is that it's 2.8 on a fairly wide angle lens. And the other part is just that I think these are not the strongest lenses in terms of their bokeh performance. Now we're going to jump into sharpness real quick here. This is the 24mm, and if I look in the center here, you can see lots of detail, of course, in things like the fence down here, these buildings and everything. And as I go off to the edge of the frame, you do lose a little bit of clarity, I think, on the left side here. And again, these pictures on the second day were all with the Sony a7R IV. So this is a 61 megapixel camera. You're losing a little bit of the detail on the far left here, and as you go down to the corner, it gets a little bit muddy, but there is still, I think, a lot of detail in there. Again, this is wide open at f2.8. If we stop down to f3.2, f3.5, maybe it's clearing up just a little bit, that muddiness. Probably f4, I think, is where you're getting the maximum resolution here in the far corners. Not bad. Stop down one stop and you're getting pretty much, I think you could say, near perfect performance all the way out to the corners in terms of sharpness. Looking at the same photo on the 20mm lens, again zoom into the center, we've got plenty of detail, no question about that. Go over to the far left here and it's pretty much the same story. Maybe you're getting a little bit muddy on this far edge here, and as we go into the corner on these rocks and this grass, yeah, you lose a little detail. It's not terrible by any means, but it's, you know, obviously going to be less than the center. If we start stopping down to 3.2, 3.5, f4, 4.5, yeah, after about f4, it doesn't seem to improve too much more. So it's almost exactly the same story on both of these lenses here. Stop down about one stop and you'll get more or less the max performance in terms of sharpness from corner to corner. Otherwise, they're plenty sharp for most of the frame, wide open at 2.8. The last thing I want to show you from this day is Vignette. So ignore the fact that the lighting here was terrible, and there is some kind of color banding as I go through these, but I just like to scroll really quickly through these and you can kind of see the effect of the vignette disappearing a little bit more easily. So this is wide open at 2.8 on the 24mm, and as we scroll through here, I'm going to go back and forth and you can maybe see that vignette opening up a little bit. And I think that right there, right at f5, maybe f4.5, 4.5 I guess, is where it really, right there, just kind of clears up. I'd say f5 is where it really clears up, and as you go down it does get a lot better right here by f3.5, and then there's just that little bit more that clears up by f5. And on the 20mm here, let's open up a bit and scroll back and forth, ignoring the color banding there, just looking in the corners for that vignette, and right about there, this is f4, maybe f4.5 opens up just a little bit more. Around f4, I think the shading in the corners really clears up quite a bit. But again, if you go from wide open by about f3.5, it's pretty good up to f4. Maybe f4.5 clears those corners up even just a little bit more. So this was the last day yesterday, and the reason that I have this sunburn, I took it out to a BMX event, and I tried to do what I can to test the autofocus speed, the reactiveness of it as somebody comes into frame, and things like, of course, chromatic aberration against the bright backgrounds, the shiny metal. And I have to say, from using these on this shoot, both in terms of the perspective and the autofocus performance, I actually preferred the 20mm. I don't know why. I felt like the autofocus on the 24 was a little bit more sticky for me, a little bit less reactive. I got less shots off because the autofocus was waiting for the lens to catch up, I guess. And I did misfocus a bit more with the 24, and that's why I didn't actually shoot it all that much compared to the 20, because just it didn't feel as good. And also just the extra wideness of the 20mm I think really lent itself to getting a little bit more of that perspective distortion and exaggeration that looks kind of cool in a situation like this. So I shot a lot more with the 20mm yesterday. So let's just take a look at some of these pictures. So this was Flatland BMX, obviously not super challenging for the autofocus, but combined with the wide angle and pretty decent autofocus performance in terms of speed, you know, rock solid, super sharp. You can see all kinds of detail. And, you know, around things like this contrasty bike seat here, where you've got the sun shining off that, the strong sun, I don't see any purple or green fringing, any issues that make that look ugly there. On the front here, where it's a little bit shiny, up against the sky in the background here, that sharp contrast. I don't see any problems. Of course, that's the center of the frame, but everything looks really, really great here. Again, here we've got a nice, strong sun shining off that bike right here. Really, I don't see any problems in terms of chromatic aberration. At least in the center of the frame, it does really, really well. Again, lots of detail, nice and sharp. Around here, no problems. Around that shiny end of the bike handle here, looks really, really good to me. And again, the autofocus kept up fantastic. I was just snapping off shots, as you can see here. I got a bunch of them, and it didn't miss except for here. It just totally lost it for a second there. But that was the only time that I felt like the 20mm messed up, and that might have been user error. So taking a look at this shot here, we can check out things like chromatic aberration off to the edge a little bit more. So around these trees here, I don't see anything extreme. Of course, that's out of focus. You can see that really kind of ugly blur there But if we go up to this side here, we've got some wires in the sky here up against the clouds, up against the blue, slightly out of focus, but nothing really jumping out at me here. And now even around here, around this bike handle, that's where I can see maybe the most. Looks like it would possibly struggle potentially with chromatic aberration. No problem. Autofocus grabbed him, no problem. I was shooting this at 1/2000th of a second, and as he popped up from here, the lens had to react pretty quickly, and it did a very good job. Again, here we've got all this white on black, no problems there. All around the outside of his shirt, everything, his hat. No problems. I think this looks really, really clean. Autofocus, again, just grabbed onto him as he popped up out of this ramp. No problem. One more example of autofocus. We're going to jump back to this first shoot here. And I tried to follow my daughter, my 1.5-year-old daughter here, as she ran at the camera. And let these pictures load for a second here. This is again with the A7C. Last picture here, lost her a little bit, but she was going off to the side of the frame. But otherwise, I think that it really followed her quite nicely. It's a wide angle lens. It's all going to be quite in focus anyway. And before we go back to take a look at a couple of the shots from the BMX shoot with the 24mm, let's just take a look at that same kind of autofocus running test with my daughter here. Let's grab a handful of photos. Here it kept up beautifully. The 24mm did fantastic here. Every picture looks rock solid, super sharp. So now switching over to the 24mm here, I managed to get a much more challenging picture here with the 24mm shooting right into the bright sun side of the sky, and you can see a little bit maybe a chromatic aberration. This is the most extreme I could see on any of these photos in this tire, but even then it really is not bad, and I don't really see any problems anywhere else around the bike, around his legs, his feet, anything like that. The chain, the back tire really seems to do pretty well too. This again, this is the most extreme in terms of chromatic aberration that I found from any of the photos that I was taking on these different days. Now just to wrap it up, this is what I mean by I struggled a little bit more with the 24mm. This is exactly the same location, situation, and timing, lighting, everything as I was showing you with the 20mm, and you can see that this picture is just, it didn't catch him. It couldn't keep up. It couldn't snap off enough frames after he jumped out of this ramp. And I did get some pictures, of course. If you go a little bit later, where am I? Let's look at around here, for example. Obviously, I did get him in focus for some of these shots, but for a lot of the shots, I felt like it was slower to react. And I had the cameras on the same setting, both A7R4s, and that's what I found. That's what I felt. I really just had a lot more fun with the 20mm. So the bottom line is that I think for an f2.8 compact, lightweight prime lens that I think would be great for travel, these lenses did not really disappoint me in any way except for maybe the focus noise. But things like distortion and whatnot, that's to be expected. The main point that I took away from this is that they're sharp. That goes all the way out to the edges of the frame. They don't have any major problems with flare or chromatic aberration. And their autofocus seems to work pretty well for the most part. There were a couple of shots, like I talked about, that the 24mm let me down yesterday, but other than that, for these couple months that I've been using them, I didn't have any major problems that jumped out at me as being experience killers. These lenses performed well. For video, there may be different issues, of course. Again, that autofocus noise, things like focus breathing may be more of an issue in those cases, but for just light compact lenses that you might want to grab with you to have on a vacation, or just to throw in your bag to have as backup because they take up literally almost no space, then I think that for me, I might rather get these lenses and take those few sacrifices than spend 3 times the price on the new Sony ones. No doubt those are going to be great lenses, but 3 times the price for an f2.8 prime lens doesn't really excite me. For me, these lenses are going to be more about convenience, about having something light and compact that I can bring with me without having to have a large camera bag, or that again I can throw into my camera bag as a backup, or something to have just in case. But I'm sunburned, I'm tired, I have a headache, and so I'm going to sign off from this one. Again, I didn't intend this to be a super detailed review, but hopefully you could get some answers if you're curious about these lenses. Otherwise, let me know down below if you have any questions or comments. I do have to send these lenses back today, actually. However, there may be things that I skipped over in this video that I could answer if you want to know them, so let me know down below. And if you like this video or found it helpful, please do consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribing if you haven't already, and as always, thank you for watching.